Hello and welcome back. So last time we went through a bunch of ratioed out fluid builds for refining, making lube, cracking heavy oil, cracking light oil. And at the end I slapped down some carriages and whittled on about how we could feed carriages into these builds. So I thought it would be quite a quick job. I decided I'd make the refinery complex, and I assumed it would just be a case of slapping them down, putting a rail station on it, and making a cup of tea, going home. Didn't turn out that way. As you may be able to see from the total time in this creative mode world, we're now up to 11.5 hours. Yeah, there's been a bit of tinkering. So I'll walk you through the process, but I'm not going to attempt to recreate that process. Right, so first of all, what I did was I went through each build and slapped down multiples of it. So here is the lube build. So this is 8 rows of the lube columns. 8 columns of the lube columns? Anyway, 8 of them. So if we were to empty 8 carriages worth of fluids in this end of the heavy oil, we would get 8 carriages worth of lube out the other end. That's the basic idea. The same for cracking, so carry on down, yeah. So this is heavy to light cracking, light to petroleum cracking. So again, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 of the columns. We would feed in the inputs over this side and we'd get the product out this side, stick a tray in both sides of the stack, and off you go. So everything starts with refining. I thought I would start with the refinery. The refinery needs to have a train of water brought in and a train of crude. And then all the pipes have to join up. So this sounds trivial. Actually getting all the pipework to line up is not as simple as it sounds. Have to rely on undergrounding things. So what I did first of all was slap down the stations and then do everything overground with pipe. Now these builds are pretty much at the knife edge of what the pipes can carry. If you remember, I built them out to the capacity of pipes. So there is no way that this would work because the loss of fluid pressure in these very long runs of pipe would destroy any throughput. However, it is a useful mechanic to find out how things are going to be plumbed and routed. Okay, so I did that for the inputs and for the outputs. The outputs are quite a bit more of a problem than the inputs because there's 3 outputs and it becomes combinatorially more complicated to do the plumbing. Anyway, after a lot of fussing about, I came up with this, which looks quite neat. So we have heavy light petroleum. So then the petroleum station is the closest one because that's the highest volume. So these have to be brought in that staggering. But because these modules are put back to back, we then have petroleum light heavy. So this has to be done the opposite way for the staggering. Okay, so that's the pattern repeated throughout. Each of these double modules, because we share a central run of beacons, has the heavy on the outside, then the light, then the petroleum light heavy. So you get this fan in, fan out type thing going on. So again, lots of runs of pipes. There's no way the fluid mechanics would work on this. So what I did was went through multiple rounds of replacing all the pipes I could with pumps. And because you can put a pump next to a pump, that meant that all the gaps here could be collapsed away. So we could make this from here to here half the depth. That was pretty cool. And then on the other side, let's run over here. Makes a much bigger difference this side. I'm just going to throw down a power because this flashing is annoying. There we go. All right. So you can see there's just a lot of pumps here. Wherever there was room for a pump, I put a pump in. Wherever we could get away with undergrounds, I did undergrounds. There's never a stretch of more than three bits of pipe. So normally it's just a corner or just an underground pair. If possible, where I do corners, I tend to do pump, corner, pump. So here you can see pump, corner, pump. If you don't do that, then the pressure drops off. Now, that's really important for petroleum and for crude because they're the highest volume fluids. For the light oil, that's not so important. You can get away with a few doubles. And for heavy oil, it doesn't matter at all. I probably could use pipe everywhere. But I used pumps for consistency and to compress down the width, like here. Okay, so what happens when we fire this up? So what I did was I took a blueprint of this build, slapped it down here, and put creative mode void fluid sources here and here. And on the far side of the build also, there's creative mode voids here. And then fired up the build and compared the throughput to the theoretical maximum according to max rate calculator. So that worked okay. We got within a couple of percent of the theoretical maximum. Firing it up also showed a couple of pumps that were around the wrong way, a couple of pipes that needed rerouting. Okay, so that's all fine. Except in the real world, we're going to be doing this with fluid trains. So what I did was, as I made fixes to this, I ported them back over to this build. So whenever I moved a pipe or changed a pump, I put it down here on this build. So that this was a real life carbon copy of what was running here, except for the creative mode hacks. Then, when this was running, and I thought it was running effectively, I took a final blueprint of this, slapped it down over here, and wired it up to trains. So let's run over here. So these trains are being filled with creative mode fluid sources. There you are, you can see it's filling. It is full. Then it comes into a stacker, because if you remember, my design for all these train stations is that you have a train directly behind the train that's unloading so that it can immediately come in. Okay. There you are. So there's absolutely minimum lag time unloading things. Then I ran this and we lost about 7% performance. Okay, similar thing here. So we unload our trains. We fill up our trains from the build. We have 3 trains. Then that goes into stations to unload fluids. Okay, you can see that this immediately unloads because we have 3 pumps unloading each single carriage. Then it goes through in stacks. So as soon as this leaves, the next train to empty pulls in. There you are. You can see this train is just pulling in straight behind it. It really does minimize the downtime. There's no point having 3 pumps loading these wagons because it's buffer loading. This is outputting effectively directly into these carriages. It's filling them up at production rate. These tanks are just there to buffer it while the next train pulls in so that you don't have any backing up in the production. Okay, what did I learn from this? Let's look at the fluid production chart because I think this illustrates the problem. Okay, So that's 1 hour. Yeah. I don't know how well you can see here. The production here has big sawtooth pattern, big sawtooths. And there's a bit here, but it's nothing like it was over here. And this was even worse on the... This is the consumption graph. The production graph was just crazy. Okay, so let's get rid of that. Sorry. Let's just... Okay, so you see these periodic dips. These dips were just huge, and they were accounting for about a 7% performance loss. And they initially coincided with the crude train pulling out. So whenever the crude train was pulling out, was about to, you get a dip in production. And the reason was that this was offloading into these tanks. I've had to add in extra tanks. And if any one of these columns backed up for any reason, this one tank would be desperately trying to empty when all the others were already empty. So 7 out of 8 of the builds would be starved for input, while this single one that was running slow couldn't output. That had a knock-on effect at the far end, where these tanks loading up the petroleum would be desperately trying to put stuff in here, but one of them would be empty because its stack wasn't running quite as efficiently. So things were backing up and going dry. So this accounted for most of my 10 hours of tuning stuff. 3 things. First of all, there was a single bit of routing of the petroleum. It was this one here. It had one place where there was a pipe segment next to a pipe segment. So it was it was this corner here. It had pump corner to ground. That pump corner to ground was cumulatively costing 5% performance on this entire build, which is just insane. So I moved some pipes around. I had to move the water out of the way. So by doing pump corner pump ground, I recovered 5% of the performance of this entire build. Now, it's probably only 1% performance of this stack, but because all the stacks interact by having common fluid sources and common fluid sinks, as in the fluids all come out of the same train and all go into the same train, and those things have to happen at the same time as one another, very small differences in performance of the different refining stacks were adding up to massive overall performance costs. So, one piece of pipe, 5% performance on the build. That's just insane. The other thing that was happening was these trains were not managing to empty entirely evenly because the stacks weren't running exactly the same speed. And there's just no way to get them to run identically speed because they all have different arrangements of pipes feeding them. So there's going to be very slightly different bottlenecks. So the first problem was these wagons carry 25k of fluid. These tanks carry 25k of fluid. As soon as the tank is not being actively pumped into, it starts to lose pressure. Once it loses pressure, the pump emptying doesn't seem to as effectively maintain pressure in its pipes. So fluid wasn't reaching the very end of this stack if this tank was running low. The way to fix that is to add 2 tanks. So you have a first tank. This is the one which the trains are unloading into. And it's doing so with 2 pumps. So it's unloading as quickly as it can with as high pressure as it can. And that's fine. Then once this is pumped into here, you have a second pump which pumps into this one. And this now, if I hover over it, this is at 25,000 crude. We can just leave it there. It is still at 25,000 crude. It just stays at 25,000 crude, right? This one up here, right? So if I hover over this, you can see this is staying at 25 crude, and it just stays there. Even though the train has left and this one was empty, this stayed at 25. Right. The other bit of magic I needed to make this work was to load balance across these. And you can see the load balancing more clearly on the water. So I did all this load balancing on the crude. I was still getting dips. The dips were coinciding with the timing of the water train. Bit of a hint there. And so this needed load balancing across here. So there's various wiring. It's difficult to see what's going on. So let's have a look at a build down here. Okay. Get rid of the flashing because I don't think it helps. Okay. So the intuition behind this is we have an input from the train going off to the rest of the build. We want to try and even out how much fluid is in these tanks, which means we need to be able to pump fluid out of the tank, and we need to be able to pump fluid into the tank. So far, so straightforward. Except when do we pump? So then there's this central line of pipes. Right, so that would extend off like that. So there's a central backbone of pipes, and the eight of these things are going to load balance across them. So the idea is you have an incoming signal which is a sort of percentile above average full, so that it's saying you're significantly more full than the average fullness of the tanks. If you are significantly more full, you need to donate some of your fluids to other tanks. So the way this works is there's an incoming signal X. If your fluid is greater than X, then output a B for balance. Then the pump which is emptying the tank is enabled when B for balance is greater than 0. So if you have too much stuff, you're going to start emptying yourself with this pump. Then, if B equals 0, so you're not overly full, then this pump is switched on, so you will be taking fluid from other tanks. Right, we need a left-handed and a right-handed version of this, and if I just there we are. Okay, so you can see how this stitches together into a pipe backbone. All of these tanks are now load balancing across. If one of these tanks was overly full, it would turn on its balance pump. It would turn off its filling pump. So it would start emptying its content out, donating it to this backbone. All the other ones would be turning on their incoming pump and would accept that fluid. We have to have pumps on here, otherwise this tank would start to backflow into the balancing, and the fluid mechanics would be horrible, but also we wouldn't be able to control where things were going. So that's how the fluid balancing works. Okay. So that's fine. The third thing was that there was, in the petroleum, a couple of cases like this. One of them I fixed, one of them I didn't. But the extra piece of pump in the case where I did fix it was actually causing that petroleum wagon tank not to fill as quickly as it should, and resulting in one of these wagons being still filling for about a quarter of a second after the other ones had filled, causing production to back up on 7 out of 8 of the stacks. So I addressed that. So with all these tweaks, this build running on trains, as long as you have one train backed up each time. Let's ride with this train. Right, so as long as you have one train backed up, I'm thinking of moving the load balancing from these to those actually, so that this doesn't happen. But in any case, right, so it comes here, it fills up. And then this runs round, and we are now queued up behind this train. Brilliant. Okay. So production now is at 510. It goes up to about 518. Theoretical maximum is 528. So we are within about 2% of theoretical maximum production for this module. You can see production is dipping down a bit periodically. It's now a case of, just how much load balancing do I want to do across the trains. But we're pretty much there. So the one thing I'm going to do off camera is change the load balancing from these tanks, which are feeding the build, onto these tanks, which are emptying from the train. But once I've done that, I'm going to call this build as done and drop it down in the real game. At the moment, these are coming out this way. For the real build, they'll need to come out this way. Okay, but that's all that track weaving is stuff I can do offline. So what next? There is kind of no point putting down half of a fluid build, right? So once I've moved the load balancing from here to here, this build I'm going to call. There's not much point putting it down in the main game yet, though, because I need similarly to have I need to have the lube and light and heavy cracking working, because at the moment there would be nowhere in the real game for the heavy and light oil to go, and if there's nowhere for them to go, the refinery complex will just back up immediately. So yeah, the next step for me is to build the mock-ups of lube, heavy cracking, and light cracking. I'm going to do it in exactly the same way. So this is the skeleton. Then I will put train stations before and after with my naive plumbing with overground pipes. Then I will copy paste that over here. I will replace all the overground pipes with pumps. Then I will clone that. Wherever there is a fluid input or output, I'll chop the track, put in the creative source and sync, check that the build does work at high throughput. Then I will again copy paste the debugged version of that here, put in real trains, see if it really works with actual train timings. And that's my plan for the next day, I guess. That's going to take a little bit of time and take up quite a lot of map space. You can see how big these builds get. So that's it, really. Sorry I don't have any real gameplay to show. Short of doing live streams, there's no sensible way to show you this stuff happening. It's just a lot of drinking cups of tea and swearing and looking at production charts, which makes for great slow TV, but not very good episodes. Anyway, thanks very much for watching. This fluid build is a complete nightmare. It is the one thing that's holding me up with my mega base. It's just going to take a bit of time to get right, and if we don't get it right, obviously the whole idea of sending ridiculous numbers of rockets to space is just never going to fly. So it has to be done. It's not the thing I enjoy the most. I still don't have any intuitive feel for how fluids actually work. I guess partly because I just can't see units of fluid flowing down pipes. So the only way I can do it is to build it, and building it just takes hours and hours and hours. And things like finding, that single pipe segment that needed moving, which you can only find by running. So I'm going to sign off here, stop babbling. Have a great time. Hope you're still enjoying. In an episode or two, we will be back in the main world, start blatting these down and start hooking them up to resources. And that's going to be the fun thing. So as soon as I've got refineries down, we are going to start pulling in oil, coal, copper and iron and fire up that little sub bit of the megabase, and then take the resulting red, green, blue circuits and start producing an embarrassment, a cornucopia of modules. All right, well, thanks very much for watching. I will see you again soon, and have a great time.